So, for example, a washing machine can not wash clothes unless it has a plumbing system that it can hook up to, cannot wash clothes unless it has an electrical system to hook up to, and it most likely can't really do a good job unless you have soap, which is part of the chemical industry. So now we have three very essential things that without the washing machine would be obsolete. Similarly, a missile system, which is much more complicated, you can think of the engineering system. My grandma worked at the factory that did most of the metal sheathing for rockets that went to NASA for a long time. Laddish, I think it's called. But there was also the rocket fuel company. There was also the guidance company, the computer company. There was also the astronaut training resource industry that also existed. So without all these supplemental and collaborative industries, a missile can't get up into the sky. Does society always choose the best technology? Most likely it does not. Probably should be a question mark there. Apple OS and Linux versus Windows. If you ever use Linux or you know much about it, it's much more flexible, but it's also a lot more difficult to use. Similarly, Apple seems very easy to use, but it doesn't seem that flexible if you're a big computer nerd. And then Windows is sort of right there in the middle. It's sort of this imperfect, always broken thing in between, and it just dominates the industry. And it's the number one operating system. So you have to ask yourself, did we choose the best operating system, the best technology, or was it another factor such as class and economics that influenced how our specific technology became a dominant technology? Similarly, we can look at power generation. Nuclear power is by far the cleanest type of power because it produces the least overall waste. That's even compared to things like solar energy, where there's sort of this 30-year obsolescence and you got to get rid of a whole bunch of fossil fuel material in the form of the solar panels. And wind energy as well can be similarly wasteful just because you have to produce a lot of metal and a lot of other pollutant type activities. So nuclear is actually the least environmentally hazardous. That is, if it doesn't have a meltdown and cause mass radiation. And so there's a huge public fear about the role of nuclear energy and how it could negatively affect societal health. And because of all these debates, we see that coal-fired power plants are still the number one type of power that we have, even though we have all these excellent other types of options. So we did not choose the right technology. And we can think, why are fossil fuels dominant? It's because we have industries that are politically influential, that are able to demand that we use the most profitable type of energy rather than the most effective type of energy. What can be the impact of engineering on society? I mentioned a little bit about the favela and how having an unplanned community can wreak havoc on transportation and other infrastructural needs. We can ask, from whom does the engineering and what kind of tasks do they do? To what kind of influence do they have? If you go to any architectural or engineering firm, it's going to be very hierarchical, with the owner of the firm having the last say and the grunt workers having very little influence and being assigned relatively technical, nuanced jobs. That is regardless of individual intelligence or individual capability within those work environments or those technological environments. And so let's say you have very talented people at the very bottom. They're younger. They might be from more diverse backgrounds. And you have these older white men at the top. You're going to have technology designs, engineering designs that might reflect the values and the needs and the experiences of old white people opposed to a diverse set of young people. It's just some way that many people have critiqued this situation, or the idea that engineering can somehow reproduce prejudices and unequal systems. There's a bunch of other ways that we can have this conversation, but that's just one of the ways we can see engineering being a social system as much as it's a technical system. There's a article I have recommended, Do Artifacts Have Politics by Langdon Winner. Winner asks, how is the goodness of technology measured? Is a technology good or is it bad? We can look at its contributions to efficiency and productivity, but also the positive and negative environmental side effects, as well as the manner in which they facilitate or reestablish certain power structures. So we can look at whether or not a technology is just about producing more cars or having faster internet. We can also look at if those goals are weighed down by environmental contamination, the increased use of fossil fuels to power server centers, the need to restrict the growth of the technology to lower, more marginalized and impoverished parts of society. And that would also help to reestablish sort of a hierarchy. So, for example, why isn't Twitter or Facebook a publicly owned company? It's because those companies want to help maintain their own profit margins and the control that they have over them. They do not want politicians or the everyday citizen to necessarily control how people share their news about their day. Winner says it's not the technology, it's how it's used. There is a common phrase that you hear about firearms. It's not the gun, it's whoever used the gun. When we talk about gun violence, I think that's a very controversial and political statement, but I think Winner might agree with that slightly. It's not the technology, it's how it's used. A thing can't have politics. A gun, for example, can't have politics. A nuclear reactor can't have politics. They are inanimate objects without consciousness or sentience. Technology is neither inherently good nor bad for that same reason. People have politics, and people use the technology to achieve certain ends. And the social and economic system in which the technology exists is far more important. Of course, you might say, well, yeah, of course, if a gun didn't exist, people wouldn't act in a certain way. So you can't necessarily just give all the credit to the person if you don't see that gun as something that is a possibility maker, right? And I think that's a fair argument as well. And that's sort of something that we can see the nuances of this type of argument taking place. Winner uses the example of New York City, the Long Island Expressway. I've never been on this, but it's a pretty famous example. And what you can see here on the screen, two pictures from the 1920s of this rather populous freeway and a bunch of bridges that are built over the freeway. Well, so what Winner says is that these were being built in the 1920s to 40s in order to facilitate car travel and also to dissuade mass transit. Who is riding in cars versus mass transit? You see in cars, mostly during this time, it's going to be like wealthy or middle class white people. And then who is running on public transportation from New York? You're going to see it's going to be mostly impoverished non-white people. Building on this, why don't we want to have bridges that allow people to pass under them so they can also use the freeway in this alternative type of vehicle? Well, what do they have in Long Island and other places? They have parks, they have nice, safe suburbs that are very underpopulated when compared to the big metropolis that is New York City. So a lot of people flee to the suburbs to get away from the city's problems, right? You sort of see that idea. So Winner uses this idea to ask, what was the impetus behind this design? What were the questions and conversations going into this idea of not allowing public transportation to even use the road? And this, of course, demonstrates racism, classism, a bunch of other really problematic forms of prejudice that we can see are very much political and very much help to reproduce a very specific set of politics. So we see then inventions as an extension of the social order. These Long Island Parkway passes, there's over 200 of them, as little as 9 feet of clearance. You cannot get a 12 or 13-foot box truck or a semi truck through them, or even a city bus for the most part. They're built to discourage the presence of buses on the parkways, and buses were a class issue. And we also see that the builder, Robert Moses, who was responsible for the design of Central Park, also wanted to block railway access to the beaches in Long Island. So this is very much about segregating beaches, if we wanted to put this in very clear terms. The designer of Central Park designed a highway in order to segregate bridges, and unquestionably there was going to be some prejudice. Whether or not he was a fervent racist or just a casual racist, it still shows that there was some racist consequences to this desire to prevent black people and non-white people from going to the Long Island's beaches. You can see design for politics, and Winner sees a few different examples that are very similar. So the broad boulevards of Paris, they were built by Napoleon III, so the, I think, great nephew of the first important Napoleon. And if you ever see the movie or the play Les Miserables, you'll see there's a big barricade that people use to block off the streets of Paris. This was something that Parisians were doing for hundreds of years. And at the end of one very specific protest, Napoleon said, we're going to bulldoze the slums and the working class communities of Paris. We're going to build big boulevards so we can march our columns of soldiers down the streets. So in effect, the city design and most modern city designs we see to this day are meant to prevent the ability of communities to box themselves off from riots. UT Austin Student Union is a public space, but you can see a similar desire to prevent riots. And this is something that I don't know if I have an image on here on the screen, and I gotta double check to see if I have it, but we see the architecture in the 60s and 70s in response to anti-Vietnam protests, removing windows from the first several floors of university buildings, particularly ones that deal with science and engineering. Because if you remove those windows, you can't break the windows. You can't occupy the buildings as easily, and they become a sort of fortified space. So once again, we have this idea, we're going to design a building that's going to prevent public demonstration. And then in Soviet architecture, so during the Cold War, 1930s to 1990s, more or less, Soviet architecture was socialist, non-capitalist, so it was looking to establish a more communal social order, one that didn't reproduce class hierarchies, so they created these large collective plazas, these broad boulevards for everyone to share, and then they had huge scale of apartment blocks and government buildings that would be all built all at the same time and sort of interlaced with one another and really in this close proximity. So something that was very collective, non-hierarchical, very Soviet in that response. Winner also talks about the myth of efficiency as a motivator. So the idea that technology only exists because we want a better way to do things is sort of a lie. Rather, what we can see is that there's a lot of technological innovations that are meant to reshape the social order. For example, the McCormick factory used pneumatic molding machines to produce their engine blocks, and this produced an inferior quality at a higher cost, according to Langdon Winner. And this was done as the desire to get rid of unionized, organized labor from the factory and instead put more control into the factory owner's hands. I think we see this with like robots going on nowadays, particularly in like automotive factories. Robots are taking over the role of people. Not all designs are intentional. Not all social uses are intentional. So you can just think of, I'm just thinking of the idea of Propecia hair loss medicine. Once again, I'm in my 40s, so I get a lot of Propecia ads on my social media getting suggested to me. on generic social media or generic Propecia. What does Propecia do? It was initially designed to be a medicine to help your prostate, avoid prostate cancer, avoid prostate inflammation, and what people found is that it helped to regrow hair. So now you have this one type of medicine having a secondary use that is now far outweighing its first initial use. How do we get good or better results? How do we judge this? We can look at the economic costs and benefits. Are jobs created or lost? Is income generated or lost? What are the environmental impacts? Does it help clean or toxify the environment? Does it create pollutants? Does it cause disease? Do we see that there's risks to health or safety? Cars, for example, we could make cars infinitely fast as possible, but that might not be a good benefit for society. We might have an impetus to restrict the advancement of technology for a few different reasons. There is also this very famous book by Ralph Nader, Unsafe at Any Speed. It was about the Pinto, this car that could explode very easily because its gas tank was in the trunk, and most accidents happened with this car in the trunk. And so all these cars were exploding. It was just this very unsafe car, right? So not a good public health technology. And then consequences for the form and quality of human associations. I think there's a lot of conversation about social media. Before social media, we're going to see technology like television and video games and movies and music all having similar types of conversations about how are these artifacts, how are these cultural products influencing the health of our society? Is it encouraging violence? Is it encouraging enemy and alienation? What is it doing? Choices are made, or do we make choices? We can see that the importance of an introductory stage of a technology is going to be central. If you flub the launch, people might not accept the technology, even though it's better than the previous technology. Every decision is based on assumptions, often unexamined assumptions. So every decision to adopt a specific technology is based off of cultural assumptions that might not necessarily be apparent for the people even making those assumptions. And then we can look at the idea of centralized versus decentralized technology. And in the United States, we tend to like decentralized technology, but there are some examples like internet fibers, which are incredibly centralized, whereas social media is incredibly decentralized. So we can look at the different centralization, how many people control the totality of a technology infrastructure, and how much of that technology infrastructure is controlled by a broad amount of people. I also recommended the work Cyborg Anthropology by Donna Haraway. If we talk about cyborgs, we can look specifically at this. On the screen here, I got an example of Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek. This is a story arc from the Next Generation Star Trek series from the 80s to the 90s, where the main character, the captain, this is played by the actor Patrick Stewart, which you might recognize from X-Men and a few other very important sci-fi and pop culture items. He, in this episode, is assimilated by a species that is a hive mind based around a computer, and all they want to do is assimilate everybody into this technology and make them all sort of automatons. And he gets kidnapped by them, and he's being used as sort of a pawn to take over the democracy-loving Federation of Planets. Anyways, this was sort of a theme in like the 80s and 90s as we're winding down the Cold War. You see a lot of people concerned very much about the role of technology and computerization and digitization of society and how it's going to have this sort of dehumanizing effect. And Haraway really engages with this long-term debate about the man versus the machine. What is the soul within this broader organism that we have, and how is it defined by other types of machines? So what's the machine, what's the organism? When we all wake up, and within 10 minutes of waking up, most of us grab our cell phones to look at the time or look at our social media. Where do we end as an organism, and where does the machine begin? We can look at our social reality, what actually is getting produced by technology versus the social fiction, what's being promised by this technology. One of the big lies I think we're getting told is about the space race now, where we see all these rocket companies emerging to send billionaires into space, to launch satellites into space, and it's being sold as this sort of revolutionary advancement of society. But you might be able to argue that it's just reproducing a bunch of very problematic economic inequalities. Haraway also looks at feminism, socialism, and materialism as we're getting away from this Cold War where the Soviet Union and socialism sort of failed and didn't win out against capitalism for a few different reasons. What's the role of other types of identities such as race and gender in this new modern world? Is there still a place for socialism? Did socialism completely fail, or was it just this one particular type of Soviet socialism? And then we can also look at materialism. A big reaction of places like the United States after the Cold War was to increase commercialization and the economy, and this really just hyped up materialism. For example, in the favela, you see there is this like tenfold rise in the income of favela people over the last 20 years, and almost all of it goes toward buying cars and cell phones. So really problematic. You have this Rousseauian idea of the ghost and the machine. This is a old Enlightenment debate about where does the soul start and the animal begin, type of thing. And this is a big question I think we can ask ourselves in the digital age. Haraway is definitely very much concerned about this in the 1980s as the digital age is just getting kicked off. There's Star Wars, which Haraway mentions, and this is not the movie Star Wars. This is a program promised by Ronald Reagan to have lasers that shoot missiles out of the sky. We still don't have this nowadays, but Ronald Reagan spent billions of public money to help develop this system, and it was very highly politicized and highly problematic because it didn't really look like it was good technology even from the start, and Ronald Reagan just sort of wanted this nice little optics of it. And so there's questions about it. We might be getting close to it soon, but after 40 years we still don't have the laser technology that Ronald Reagan spent money on instead of trying to help cure AIDS during the 1980s pandemic. Then we can look at Frankenstein's monsters, just sort of this analogy of this broader issue of where technology defines our lives. So the cyborg is more or less a modern day Frankenstein. Where can we examine the cyborg? We can look at medicine. People are taking all these medications. We're putting digital technology in our bodies. We can look at sex. Sex is a technology, how we understand the human body as a biological and a social identity is a technological process. We have all these technical terms to define it. What happens when we are now dismantling those technical terms and we're having this sort of post-gendered world? Donna Haraway was talking about this in the 1980s in a very compelling and inspirational way. Can think of us as a collectivity versus the individual. Are we losing our individuality in this age of social media when everyone can put their perfect self online? Is technology creating a utopia that's promised, or is it creating a dystopia, the opposite of a perfect world? Can we also look at how technology reproduces patriarchy, militarism, capitalism, and the most negative effects of state socialism, which would be more or less a closed society with limited amounts of freedom of speech? So in conclusion, we can look at old dominations and new dominations based off of the type of technology that exists in our world. We can look at representations versus simulations, how we are reflecting our society versus how we're trying to create a new type of society. We can look at perfection, trying to get the most perfect thing, or we can look at optimization of how we try to encourage the best use of what we already have. There's also this changing relationship between the public and private world. Go on the social media or the internet, and now your whole private life can be shared willingly on this very public platform. So that very strict line between what happens in the home and out of the home goes away. We have this more cyborg sense of citizenship where we all get to more or less assume responsibility for our own identity and our own relationship with how our world is represented. We have this very unique relationship. And then we can look at the replacement of white capitalist patriarchy with a types of informatics of domination, this world where information rules everything, where the information you give people for free rules everything, where information about you rules everything. White capitalist patriarchy might persist within that world, but now we see the mechanisms and the institutions that organize white capitalist patriarchy are being defined by the information society. So we will continue this discussion as we advance in the next few weeks.